Alright, it's time to piss off my Mao subscribers. A decade deep into the Cold War, Soviet and Chinese relations would take a turn for the worst, ultimately amalgamating into the Sino-Soviet split of 1956. The split was fueled by a growing conflict of interests between Moscow and Peking. One of the motivations for why the Chinese split from the USSR had to do with the Soviets' refusal to give back territory that they had inherited from the Russian Empire, whom a century prior had seized and conquered said territory from the Chinese. Another reason for the split had to do with the CPC's fear that China would lose its national autonomy that it had fought and worked so hard to win during World War II by potentially becoming a satellite to the Kremlin. There were ideological motivations for the split as well, as Chinese and Albanian communists alike would go on to writing a number of polemics against the USSR, accusing the superpower of being revisionist, state capitalist, and social imperialist as well. The accusations of revisionism stemmed from a number of criticisms, including the Soviets' choice to pursue a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West after World War II, along with the facts that Khrushchev had declared that class antagonisms in the USSR was dead, and that the USSR was a dictatorship of the whole people, as opposed to simply being a dictatorship of the proletariat, and that from there on out they should prioritize elevating living standards and economic growth over the class struggle. During the Cultural Revolution, Chinese anti-Soviet polemics would verge on outright slanderous at times, from unsubstantiated claims of capitalist restoration to Mao Zedong's famous declaration that he made about Brezhnev's Soviet Union in 1966.
Quote, "The Soviet Union today is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the grand bourgeoisie, a fascist German dictatorship, and a Hitlerite dictatorship. They are a bunch of rascals worse than de Gaulle," unquote.
In the years following the Sino-Soviet split, the USSR withdrew its economic aid to China, canceling its subsidies and withdrawing its specialists, which had the ultimate effect of reinforcing the split and fueling Chinese anti-Soviet animosity even further. By the late 1960s, tensions between the two powers had reached a boiling point, amalgamating into a number of close calls and border clashes between the Russians and the Chinese at the height of the Cultural Revolution, by which Chinese Red Guards directly led skirmishes into Soviet territory, raiding border outposts and killing dozens of Russian soldiers. Back and forth border clashes would commence, from the Soviet counterattack on Zhenbao Island to the incident in Xinjiang a few months afterwards. In the wake of these border clashes between the Red Guards and the Soviets, tensions rapidly escalated to the verge of nuclear threat by the year 1969, and at this point, Russia and China were on the cusp of a full-on hot war. Fortunately, however, in a stark turn of events, tensions would de-escalate over the following years, but Sino-Soviet relations would continue to remain strained. By the early 1970s, Mao had condemned the USSR as a social imperialist power and enemy of the world revolution. He would go on to draft Three Worlds Theory, by which he would categorize groups of countries by the First, Second, and Third World, lumping the USSR in with the United States, Britain, and France among others, while characterizing China, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America as the Third World. In effect, Three Worlds Theory became Mao Zedong's new ideological justification for why he would willingly side with the United States against the Soviet Union, and then going on to have diplomatic meetings with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. And by extension, setting the precedence for both China's foreign policy and socioeconomic developmental path in the decades to come.
Quote, "To continuously promote the world situation so that it moves in a direction conducive to peace and stability and favorable to the people of various countries," Chairman Mao Zedong pointed out during his meeting with Henry Kissinger in 1973 that as long as we share the same goal, we will not do harm to you, nor will you do harm to us, and we should work together to counter Soviet hegemonism. We hope the United States would strengthen its cooperation with Europe and Japan to draw a parallel line linking the United States, Japan, China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Europe. This is unity against the Soviet hegemonism or the strategy of forming an alliance against an opponent. At the 6th Special Session of the UN General Assembly held in April of 1974, Deng Xiaoping expounded the strategic thinking of Mao Zedong on the division of the three worlds. From the perspective of the changes that have taken place in international relations, The world today, in fact, has three sides. The United States and the Soviet Union belong to the first world. Developing countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and other regions belong to the third world, and the developed countries in between the two. China was firmly opposed to the policy of expansionism pursued by the superpowers and carried out the policy of uniting with and struggling against the United States with emphasis on striking at Soviet hegemonism, thus effectively restraining the expansionist forces of the Soviet Union, unquote.
This doesn't get pointed out nearly enough in communist circles, but there is certainly something to be said about Mao's blatant opportunism near the end of his life. Regardless of how you feel about the Soviets, the USSR was, for all intents and purposes, the world's premier socialist superpower. And despite its flaws and shortcomings, it was in fact doing everything in its power to spread and support the proliferation of socialism, while the United States and its allies have been, since World War II, crushing and working tirelessly to undermine socialism and working people's liberation wherever and whenever it would arise. How is it that Mao can go from denouncing the Soviets for peaceful coexistence to deeming them a greater evil in the world than the United States, and then proceeding to align himself with the world's principal capitalist superpower against the world's principal socialist superpower? Of course, only the most devout of Dengists and Kool-Aid drinking Gonzaloite baby boilers think that this is a good thing. That is, the Chinese aligning themselves with the Great Satan directly against the USSR, even though not even a decade prior, Mao was delivering scathing condemnations towards the Soviet Union for not wanting to flatten the planet in a nuclear exchange with the United States in response to their botched Bay of Pigs invasion. Otherwise, I hope the rest of you can see how utterly ludicrous it is to think that the direct betrayal of the USSR, the aligning with the US, and the complete abandonment of international solidarity that followed suit could lead to anything except the direct contribution to the death of communism globally, the prolonging of capitalism's lifespan by providing it with new markets and a cheap reserve labor pool numbering in the billions, and the ushering forth of the era of blackist reaction that we find ourselves in today. Needless to say, as batshit as this take might be, there are indeed communists out there that unironically believe this. In the mid-1970s, the Revolutionary Communist Party, or the RCP for short, published a number of articles titled The Red Papers. In their issue known as the Red Paper 7, they hypothesized that the Soviet Union under Khrushchev and Brezhnev had restored capitalist economic relations, and that the post-Stalin USSR had become a social imperialist power.
Quote, in Chapter 3, we have seen how the Soviet economy is developing according to regulation by the blind law of value. We have seen that the Soviet ruling class will invest only in those industries which yield the most profit. And as we have also seen, such maximum profit can only arise on the basis of exploitation, and thus, Soviet social imperialists are forced to increasingly intensify the exploitation of the Soviet working class. Soviet social imperialism is a new and rising imperialist force in the world, trying to take the place of the United States in dominating other countries, just as Britain shoved out the Dutch or Portuguese, and just as the US shoved out Britain and France, now the Soviet Union is doing the same shoving of its own, unquote.
The chapter goes on to characterize a number of the USSR's foreign aid and trade relations as social imperialism, a kind of soft imperialism where the Soviets offered the Third World a better deal relative to the United States and Western Europe, but would still go on to exploiting them nonetheless. They give a number of examples of the so-called Soviet social imperialism, from India to the Middle East to Eastern Europe as well. And while I don't plan on chronicling every single instance of so-called social imperialism in too much detail, I do plan on examining a number of examples given by the Red Paper 7, including but not limited to Soviet relations with the Warsaw Pact, Soviet aid to Cuba, Soviet aid to the Third World, Soviet relations with India, as well as the conflicts that occurred in Bangladesh in the early 1970s. And for the sake of time, I shall not be covering the Soviet interventions in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, or in Afghanistan, for I feel such topics warrant their own videos. So with all that important context in mind, let's get started. Originally, the term social imperialism was used to characterize leftists who were in favor of the imperialist economic activity of their respective capitalist states. characterizing it as a positive attribute since from their perspective, it was helping the colonized world by granting them access to first world technology and markets. Bernstein was among the first to positively identify with the term. In a text compiling a series of his essays titled The Preconditions of Socialism, Bernstein posits that imperialist economic relations are not only inevitable, but that they are also beneficial in the long run as well, stating that it was the rise of imperialism that coincided with increased wealth and workers' rights in the First World. However, in recent decades, self-described Maoists and Hoxhists have taken the term and co-opted it as to characterize the Soviet Union's foreign policy under Khrushchev and Brezhnev as a kind of imperialism in its own right, adding the social qualifier to the term as to make their theories sound more credible. Before we go through any specific examples, let us do a brief refresher on the 5 main characteristics of imperialism as defined by Vladimir Lenin.
Number 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Number 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on this basis finance capital, or a financial oligarchy. Number 3. The export of capital is distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. Number 4. The formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. Number 5. The territorial division of the world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed.
So with that in mind, does the Soviet Union fit this definition of imperialism as laid out by Lenin? Well, the short answer is no. There was no finance capital in the USSR. There were no stock markets, nor was there a class of ultra-wealthy transnational bourgeoisie, all of which are pretty important characteristics of an imperialist power. And as I shall demonstrate throughout the course of the rest of this video, the Red Paper 7 will go on to repeatedly fail to substantiate any of its claims that it makes towards the USSR. So without further ado, let us finally get started.
Quote, while the Soviet social imperialists increasingly seek hegemony throughout the world, they have also moved to solidify their hold on Eastern Europe, the backyard of social imperialism.
I find it interesting how eerily similar that the rhetoric used by the RCP is to describe the USSR sounds to the rhetoric used by the Reaganites whom were out there fear-mongering about the Red Menace and the evil empire in the 1980s. One could call it a kind of inverted anti-Soviet horseshoe theory, if you will. The further you get from critically supporting the Soviet Union, the more you begin to sound like a Trotskyist or a neocon.
Those who accuse the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe of being colonies to the Soviet Union typically point to the Comecon alliance as an example of such. The Comecon countries, that is, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the DDR, Hungary, Poland, and Romania were supposedly satellites that were politically subjugated by the USSR in the same way that the Western powers dominate the Third World. The Soviet Union levered its political power as well as its economic hegemony over these countries which were completely at its mercy, or so they say.
Recall that it is according to Marx that it is the mode of surplus extraction from which all other political and economic relationships emerge, as well as the relationship between rulers and ruled. And so, in order to say that the Eastern Bloc countries were satellites or colonies to the USSR, one must first demonstrate that there was 1. Some kind of exploitative relationship that was going on, and that 2. The USSR's alleged colonies were economically dependent on them in the same manner that the Third World is economically dependent on the United States and Western Europe. Was this the case? Let's see what the literature has to say about it.
Between 1970 and 1972, roughly a third of all imports from the Comecon countries went to the USSR. At the same time, imports from the USSR to the Comecon countries totaled about 35.5%. Contrast this with Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Asian countries, which imported about 75 to 80% of their goods from the advanced capitalist countries. As we can already see, the capitalist Third World is substantially more economically dependent on the imperialist First World than the Comecon countries were to the Soviet Union from a trade standpoint.
But what of surplus extraction? What of value transfer? Was there an unequal exchange transpiring between the USSR and the Comecon countries?
Between the years 1970 and 1972, trade balance between the USSR and Comecon was slightly tipped to the favor of the latter. That is, slightly more value was going to the Comecon countries of the Warsaw Pact than was being transferred to the Soviet Union. Throughout the 1960s, trade between the two blocs of countries were almost completely balanced. No value was being transferred from one to another. The Comecon countries' exports were primarily machinery and industrial equipment in exchange for raw materials and energy imports from the USSR. This relationship can be seen on the following chart. Between the Third World and the First World capitalist countries, however, this trade relationship is reversed. That is, the advanced capitalist countries exported capital, that is investment in the form of machinery, infrastructure, and factory equipment, to the Third World, while the Third World exported cheap fuel, food, and raw materials to the First World. For example, in 1973, 89% of Colombian commodity exports went to the US. In the Dominican Republic, this number was 98%. In Guatemala, 84%. In Honduras, 98%. And in Nicaragua, 82%. And in Venezuela, 99%. Food and fuel exports from Latin America to the United States constitute percentages in the 80th and 90th percentile, meaning the South American countries were then, and are still to this day, highly dependent on the United States for trade.
At the same time, the First World capitalist countries had a monopoly on advanced manufacturing technology, which allowed them to fleece the Third World at monopoly rents, allowing the First World to depress and drive down the prices of Third World labor and exports. This is one of the ways in which unequal exchange manifests between the First and the Third World. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, since the 1950s, was supplying raw materials and energy goods to Comecon, oftentimes well below market prices. In the year 1974, the Soviets sold petroleum to Eastern Europe at one-fifth its world market price. The Soviets sold raw materials and energy resources to their Comecon allies well below market prices as well, meaning that the value transfer that was occurring between the USSR and Comecon was in the exact reverse opposite direction that it was between the First World capitalist countries and the Third World capitalist countries.
In 1959, the Soviet Union purchased goods from Bulgaria above their market prices in 32 leading categories of Bulgarian exports. In Poland, the Soviets purchased goods above market prices in 28 out of 28 categories and lower in 7. Poland purchased goods from the USSR at 81% of their global market prices, while Bulgaria paid 69%. Conversely, the Soviets purchased goods from Poland and Bulgaria at 1.5 times and 1.3 times their respective global market prices.
Of course, trade relations were not always so favorable to Eastern Europe, since many of the Eastern European countries were ruled by fascist governments allied with the Nazis during World War II. During the post-war Reconstruction, in part as a form of reparations, trade relations were actually slanted in the favor of the Soviets initially. And after World War II, following a series of riots which transpired in Hungary, East Germany, and Poland, in an effort to get Eastern Europe to reject America's Marshall Plan, the Soviets offered in kind an extremely generous amount of aid in the form of $1.5 billion in loans, $1 billion in war debt cancellations, and $1 billion worth of free transfers of jointly owned enterprises exclusively to the Eastern European countries, and generous export credits as well. And so from 1956 onward, war debts were forgiven, and trade relations were heavily slanted to the favor of Comecon. At best, it can be argued that the Soviets were a hegemonic power, not an imperialist one, as it did strategically leverage its trade and its aid in an attempt to get Yugoslavia, Albania, and China to accept its hegemony as the world's premier socialist superpower. During the 1960s, when the DPRK was beginning to side with China during the Sino-Soviet split, the Soviets threatened to withdraw its military exports, forcing the DPRK to instead side with the Soviets against the Chinese. So while it is true that the Soviets leveraged their subsidies and resources to influence other socialist countries into accepting its hegemony, imperialism it did not do. And after World War II, following a series of riots which transpired in Hungary, East Germany, and Poland, in an effort to get Eastern Europe to reject America's Marshall Plan, this is not colonialism, this is not imperialism, this is by its very definition subsidizing. The Soviets were subsidizing Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. They weren't exploiting these countries. On the contrary, it actually costed them economically to maintain these trade relations for as long as they did. Moving on. Let us now overview the case with Cuba, a country which has been alleged by many anti-communists and ultras alike to have become a sugar colony to the USSR. While it is true that after the revolution the Soviets had taken over as Cuba's #1 customer for its sugar, they had done so with the intent of rescuing the Cuban economy from imminent collapse due to the United States embargo, as well as subsidizing the small island nation as it had done with the Warsaw Pact. Recall that up to that point, that Cuba was a United States export-oriented neo-colony with zero infrastructure or industry of its own in place that wasn't geared towards facilitating exports or raising the rates of exploitation. So when the Soviets stepped in as Cuba's new principal customer for its sugar, they had done so while consistently purchasing Cuban sugar well above market prices, paying 260% world prices for their sugar between the years 1965 and 1970, amounting to an annual subsidy of $173 million per year. And in total, the Soviets paid $1.17 billion in subsidies to the Cubans between the years 1960 and 1970. And when world sugar prices rose, the Soviets renegotiated to pay 11 cents per pound, which once again was well above world market prices at the time. Between 1970 and 1972, 37% of all Cuban exports and 52% of all of their imports were with the USSR. The percentage of total Cuban imports and exports at this point had been consistent throughout the 1960s, while the total number of exports had decreased over the years from 46% in 1964 to 37% in 1974. The result was that the Soviets had been exporting significantly more value to Cuba than the Cubans had been exporting to the Soviet Union.
Quote, in addition, the Soviets provided the Cubans with cheap imports of petroleum, minerals, fertilizers, steel, machinery, trucks, tractors, and other agricultural equipment, and on top of that were also sending thousands of Soviet engineers and specialists to the country to help develop their industry. And on top of that, we're also in the process of training thousands of Cuban specialists in the construction and management of their own factories, unquote.
In total, the USSR spent about $1.5 billion subsidizing Cuba as to help it modernize and build up its army. Remember folks, the Soviets did not have to do this. They could have just as easily done as the West would have done and was doing all the way up to that point, and completely taken advantage of the Cubans, purchasing their sugar for pennies on the dollar, importing all of its own industrial equipment in the form of investment, and setting up privately owned sweatshops to exploit the Cuban workforce. But instead, the Soviets had committed themselves to uplifting Cuba and pursuing a policy of cooperative economic development that was mutually beneficial for both nations. In the Red Paper 7, the RCP tries to argue that Soviet aid in India was a prime example of economic exploitation. To quote a few excerpts from the pamphlet.
Quote, as the revisionists who seized power in the Soviet Union began to transform that country into a full-blown imperialist nation, Soviet penetration of India grew rapidly. In particular, the Soviet Union began making long-term loans to the Indian government to build up their public sector of the Indian economy. It would appear that these forces were afraid that developments of the Indian public sector could create openings for rival corporations to move in. The social imperialists were more than glad to step in where the US would not. And on the surface, Soviet loans seemed quite different from the loans offered by Western imperialists. Soviet loans had the relatively low interest rate of 2.5%, which could be paid off over a 10-year period. Furthermore, the Soviets agreed to accept payment in rupees, India's currency, instead of insisting on payments in dollars or a similar hard currency. And of course, Soviet aid could be used to develop state-owned enterprises. However, it soon became clear that there was more to Soviet aid than meets the eye. First of all, Soviet aid, unlike loans from the West, came tied. That is, India was required to spend all the money it received from the Soviet goods on goods from the Soviet Union. And the prices of the goods that were imported were determined by trade agreements and not according to free market prices. So the Soviets were able to charge exorbitant prices for outmoded machinery, thus disguising the real rate of interest on the loans. As Soviet domination of the Indian economy increased, the difference between what the Soviets charged India for industrial goods and their free market value grew.
And so there you have it, a prime case of Soviet social imperialism. Or so they say. Let us take a deeper look into the issue. Between the years 1954 and 1974, the United States supplied between 4 to 10 times as much economic aid to India as the USSR, and thus, Western aid constituted the majority of the support India was getting at the time. However, given the Soviets' very generous interest rates at 2.5%, as well as their acceptance of repayments in the form of local goods, which were not sellable on the world market, the United States was effectively forced to compete with the Soviets and offer economic support on far more favorable terms to the Indians. A UN study found that roughly 25% of the commodities exported by India to the USSR for repayments on previous credits could not have been sold on the global market anyways, meaning that India's payments on past credits and debts to the USSR posed virtually no strain on the Indian economy. Even if Soviet loans were given to India as grants, India's foreign exchange earnings would have only constituted a 0.5 to 1% increase if they were selling those goods on the global market rather than to the USSR. Furthermore, the Soviets did not export capital to India, which is a key characteristic of imperialism. They did not own the firms, factories, machinery, or industrial equipments that they were exporting. Instead, they simply sold them to India outright. In other words, they were exporting commodities, not capital, to India. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the Soviets were contracted out to construct hydro dams, steel mills, and other industrial works for the Indians, completely outpacing the construction of the privately owned British and German-owned industrial projects at the time. What this had the effect of doing was giving India the capacity to produce its own power and heavy industry goods, helping to unshackle the country from its complete historic dependence on the West for said goods, and providing it with some semblance of self-sufficiency. Again, rather than stunting India's development for decades to come under the guise of economic aid, as the West had done, the Soviets were actually making a real material effort to help India pick itself up off its own 2 feet. Meanwhile, in 1974, US corporations had sank $345 million worth of investment into the country, and like a band of pirates, private British corporations had been plundering and pillaging India for the better part of a century by that point, deliberately stunting its development and killing untold millions in the process. Background: the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 was a military confrontation between Pakistan and India during the Bangladeshi Liberation War from the 3rd of December 1971 to the 16th of December 1971. The Pakistani military had carried out a series of aerial bombings on 11 Indian military bases, which led to the Indian entry into the War for Independence of East Pakistan on the side of the Bengali military. Shortly after the war had started, India quickly emerged victorious, crushing the Pakistani military and taking tens of thousands of prisoners. Tragically, hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties occurred over the course of this conflict, and millions of Bengali refugees were created in the process. In the Red Paper 7, this is what the 69th Sword of Marx has to say about Soviet involvement in the conflict.
Quote, "While both India and the Soviet Union try to present themselves as great champions of world peace, events have proven otherwise. This is demonstrated most dramatically by the Bangladesh affair. Seizing advantage of the discontent of the masses in East Pakistan, the Indian reactionaries, backed to the hilt by the Soviets, stirred up a phony national liberation movement. They sent armed infiltrators into East Pakistan as well as starting border incidents. Having set the stage, India launched a full-scale attack on East Pakistan. Only days before the invasion, India and the Soviet Union signed a friendship treaty, which was really nothing less than a military pact. One provision called for each country to come up to the aid of the other if they were attacked. The Times of India, a leading spokesman of Indian reaction, wrote that, quote, "It is obvious that India would not have liberated Bangladesh without the Treaty of Friendship from the Soviet Union," unquote. After India liberated Bangladesh, the Soviets were quick to rush and offer aid to that country as well. The Indian subcontinent and the Indian Ocean are both extremely important in the plans of the social imperialists, and the new czars that are trying to resurrect the dream of the original czars whom sought to expand the boundaries of Tsarist Russia. In February of 1973, the government of Pakistan discovered large quantities of Soviet-made weapons and equipments destined for the Soviet-trained guerrilla warfare experts now at work in Pakistan.
Effectively, the Red Papers alleged that the Soviets had encouraged the breakup of Bangladesh from Pakistan in 1971 and had been backing India over the course of the conflict as to secure greater geopolitical, social imperialist dominance. However, in reality, this is not the case. Over the course of the India-Pakistani border conflicts at the time, the Soviets had been calling for respect for Pakistan's territorial integrity, and had sent an ambassador to Delhi in an attempt to persuade the Awami League into accepting Bangladeshi autonomy with a united Pakistan, as well as warning the Pakistan government against carrying out any sort of military intervention. And even when war did break out and India would invade, the Soviets never suspended their economic aid to the country, something that you would expect a superpower to be doing if they were really trying to encourage the breakup. And even after the war, they provided Pakistan with even more economic assistance, so much so that Pakistan actually net received more aid than India or Bangladesh did combined at that point. And the reason for this is because the Soviets wanted a parliamentary democratic system and progressive force presence in the region, since it would mean a stronger, more united non-Western, non-Chinese aligned regime in Pakistan. And thus, the Soviets were in favor of the installation of the Awami League in Pakistan, a party which, mind you, had been deposed in a military coup 1 year prior. Over the course of the hostilities, the Soviets diplomatically maneuvered to make sure that China and the United States were kept out of the conflict, putting pressure on India to initiate a speedy withdrawal. The Soviets provided no significant help to India's military during the conflict, other than the diplomatic support, of course. Meanwhile, India intervened to support the Awami League, which held vast popular support in East Pakistan as to weaken the development of a revolutionary movement in East Bengal. Regardless, the Indian intervention was supported by the people of East Pakistan and helped to install a party which secured mass democratic support a year prior. Throughout the rest of the Red Papers chapter on the subject, the examples that they use to showcase Soviet imperialism are incredibly weak and benign. Foreign assistance granted by first world capitalist countries are designed to facilitate exports of investment to the country in question and to pressure the country into restructuring their economy into being more favorable to the interests of the transnational bourgeoisie. On the other hand, the Soviets granted aid in accordance to what was actually geopolitically advantageous to the regime, as well as helping progressive anti-imperialist forces in the region. The bulk of Soviet aid to non-socialist countries came in the form of export credits, or the promise of Soviet products in exchange for prolonged repayments over the course of 10 years or longer. If a country had trouble meeting its repayment terms, the Soviets oftentimes extended the period to generous lengths. Unlike America and the West, the Soviets accepted locally produced goods as repayment for credits, helping to spur local economic activity, rather than to deprive it, which was the usual case when they accepted aid from the former. And unlike the Soviet Union, America and the West typically demanded repayment in the form of the dollar, aka the world's reserve currency, meaning that the debtor nations would be forced to drive up their domestic exports, expanding world market supply, reducing world market demand, and having the net effect of devaluing the debtor nation's domestic labor and resources, effectively making it so that the debtor nation would have to work that much harder, driving up its own exports that much more in order to pay off its debts, as opposed to the Western countries simply accepting locally produced goods and local currencies as a form of repayment in the same way that the Soviets did. Another reason why Soviet aid was more beneficial to the debtor countries was because the Soviets also set up jointly owned enterprises, which could be used to meet demand for both nations' markets. The ownership of, and by extension the profits generated from these jointly owned enterprises, were shared between the debtor nation and the USSR. Not only could these jointly owned enterprises be used to meet local demand, they could also be used to sell goods directly to the USSR, since the Soviets accepted locally produced goods in these countries as a form of repayment for their aid. And on top of that, the Soviets also granted a slew of military assistance to guerrillas and rebel forces across the Third World to aid them in their own national liberation struggles against colonialism and imperialism. The Soviets granted millions of dollars worth of arms deliveries to the following countries: Egypt, India, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Afghanistan, Angola, Indonesia, Libya, Somalia, North Korea, and Vietnam. And so while America was, and still is to this day, a bulwark of reaction, exporting fascism and anti-communism across the globe, the Soviets were a progressive force supporting national liberation efforts as well as the construction of socialism abroad. Just as capitalism is a global economic system by which the imperialists and big bourgeoisie seek to exploit and dominate markets for private enrichment, just as America must constantly finance coups, support color revolutions, assassinate labor organizers, arm and train death squads, and install puppet governments across the globe in order to prevent the spread of socialism, just as it must invade, occupy, intervene, and coerce the Second and Third World into kowtowing to its interests, responsibility by design falls upon any existing socialist powers to come together and form a socialist counter-hegemony as to frustrate the imperialist machine, crush fascism, elevate class consciousness, build international solidarity, facilitate the installation and construction of socialism, and to secure revolutionary gains wherever and whenever possible. And while I don't want to give the impression that the Soviets did nothing wrong, on the contrary, they made plenty of foreign policy errors that are worth validly criticizing and analyzing, they were, for all intents and purposes, the world's premier socialist superpower that had, since the start of the Cold War, fought tirelessly to aid the Third World against imperialism, supporting national liberation struggles left and right, handing out guns and artillery to communist guerrillas like candy to kids on Halloween, and actively going out of its way to subsidize the development of socialism everywhere. Keep in mind, the Soviets never had to strain their own economy building up Cuba, North Korea, and the Warsaw Pact. They never had to go around supporting national liberation struggles left and right. They could have just as easily done as the West had done, and continues to do, and stunt the development of the Third World, as to enrich themselves back on the home front. But they didn't. As it turns out, the communists were indeed communists. And now that the USSR is gone, now that we have lost the crucial industrial juggernaut and military machine that had for decades served as a much-needed buffer against the United States and Western Europe's bullshit, not only has world socialism and the labor movement been in non-stop remission, but now our planet is slowly dying thanks to the ecological debt being generated by modern capitalist industry. And the working people of the world are now completely at the mercy of this inhumane, exploitative, parasitic, rent-seeking, progress-stunting, crime-generating, bigotry-generating, fascism-enabling, unjust, cruel, oppressive, racist, sexist, white supremacist, queerphobic, unstable, unsustainable, irrational, impulsive, atomizing, commodifying, lobotomizing, pathological, manipulative, psychopathic, child-raping, civilization-enslaving, homicidal, ecocidal, infanticidal, genocidal, and oligarchic global economic paradigm. And so, welcome to the end of history, where the law of value reigns supreme, the good die young, and the evil are slanted to live long, happy, and prosperous lives.
This video was an absolute chore to produce, so please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and to share with your neighbors on social media. If you agree or disagree, feel free to leave a lengthy response and I'll be more than happy to engage in the comments section below. Shout out to my Patreons, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. Anyways, that is all I have to say for now, and I will see you guys next time. Stay tuned, comrades.